Before we start this video, if you haven't heard, I have another SpongeBob theory on this channel. You don't have to watch it, but if you want to, at the end of this video, I implore you to do so. The link will be down below.
Have the time?
Oh, what I wouldn't give to have a lass like that on me club.
Love. Something that can bring the best out of everyone. Something that can tear friendships and relationships apart. Love. It can do as much harm as much good. While watching SpongeBob Season 2 Episode 16, Krusty Love, I understood something about this episode. This scene right here One second, I'm getting a phone call. Oh, okay. Yeah, gotcha. Okay, I'll tell them. So all I heard was a bunch of high-pitched mumbles, but let's just go over the episode before getting into the theory. We start off with Mr. Krabs knitting a dollar bill on a snitching canvas. Then he smells something terrible. He is a penny short of his profit today. Boo-hoo. SpongeBob questions him on why he cares so much. This is important. Mr. Krabs cares about money because it lets the world go round. It lets him repair the store, lets SpongeBob be square, and lets Squidward have frilly soap. But after pointing all of this out, he soon noticed Mrs. Puff eating at a table, not caring about the whole conversation they just had. Mr. Krabs points out Mrs. Puff, and SpongeBob tells him about her. Mr. Krabs hears about her having a husband and gets upset. Then SpongeBob explains how she lost Mr. Puff. We don't talk about those days. Then SpongeBob gets the idea to break the ice and introduce Mr. Krabs to Mrs. Puff. After Mrs. Puff is done having PTSD, SpongeBob drags Mr. Krabs to the table. This scene is very important. Mr. Krabs is stiff. He isn't moving nor blinking, paralyzed even. Mrs. Puff says hello, and Mr. Krabs starts sweating uncontrollably. Then SpongeBob pushes for Mr. Krabs to say hello. He doesn't say hello, but just mumbles incoherent noises. SpongeBob has to translate for him, and after a little back and forth, SpongeBob lands Mr. Krabs a date. They head back home after work to freshen up. Remember this part. Mr. Krabs has dinner with Mrs. Puff at this fancy place. He is so enamored with Mrs. Puff that he doesn't even know how much money he was spending on her. At the end of the date, he gets the bill. He's upset with the total and ends up going back to SpongeBob crying about it. He tells them that he's stuck between his two loves, money and Mrs. Puff. Then Mr. Krabs gets the idea to give his wallet to SpongeBob and to make sure he doesn't make any irresponsible or unneeded purchases. At first, SpongeBob is hesitant, but he goes along with it. After making some plans, they head over to Mrs. Puff's house. As soon as Mr. Krabs hears Mrs. Puff's voice, his eyes turn to hearts. I think you already know what's important here. Then he orders SpongeBob to get some flowers. SpongeBob is confused with this request after being told not to spend any money, but under pressure, he comes back with flowers. Then Mr. Krabs snaps out of it and gets upset with SpongeBob. But as soon as Mrs. Puff comes back, his eyes turn to hearts and he snatches the flowers from SpongeBob and gives them to Mrs. Puff. Mr. Krabs does it again and asks SpongeBob to get some chocolates for Mrs. Puff. SpongeBob tries to reason with him, but nothing is getting through to him, and once again, under pressure, he goes and gets some chocolates. Mr. Krabs gets dejected with his actions of buying chocolates, and as if on cue, Mrs. Puff voice enchants Mr. Krabs, snapping him into a rhythm of buying unnecessary stuff again. But SpongeBob brings him back by saying that they're only going to the park. Mrs. Puff makes a comment on how she needs to go get her sun hat. But Mr. Krabs is so eager to do anything for her, he orders SpongeBob to go get a sun hat. This time, SpongeBob tries to stand his ground and tell Mr. Krabs that it is not needed. But he isn't having any of it and tells him to go buy one immediately. After doing so, Mrs. Puff tells Mr. Krabs, "I already have one." And after hearing this, Mr. Krabs barks at SpongeBob. But SpongeBob just tells Mr. Krabs that he's confused because he keeps giving him orders to keep spending, and spending. Mr. Krabs hears this and tells him that he's sorry and he will make a sailor promise not to request anything from now on. We are hit with the special "a few minutes later" and he's back at it again, doing this back and forth, buying and dejecting. Then after Mr. Krabs runs SpongeBob to the ground, SpongeBob makes this wonderful point.
Wait! Don't tell me! You want me to run down to the store and buy Mrs. Puff something she doesn't need, then you want me to run back here so you can say, "Arr, SpongeBob, and you're spending all me money." And then I'll say, "But Mr. Krabs, I'm only doing what you said!"
Mr. Krabs starts crying and really wants to get this one more thing for Mrs. Puff. SpongeBob feels guilty and gets it right away. Mr. Krabs calls to SpongeBob and cries about how he is spending all his money again. Then SpongeBob points out that he's being a hypocrite. This is it, right here. This is where I thought that this episode is making commentary on how people are blinded with love. They would do anything with their feelings and put their logic aside, not caring if it's responsible or not. Then I went to the drawing board. First things first, we need to lay out what the characters are. Let's start out with SpongeBob. He is logical, the left side of the brain. He makes responsible choices and thinks before you act. Also, the left side of the brain handles reading, writing, and calculations. Mr. Krabs is the right side of the brain. Emotion, doing things off of vibes, feelings, and well, emotion. This can cause unwanted actions, but emotions are not always a bad thing. It can be used at times to understand one another. Empathy. Last but not least, Mrs. Puff. She is love, like a crush or someone you look up to, not wanting to disappoint them or just trying to make them proud of you. Now that the characters are painted, let's go over each important scene. We first start with SpongeBob introducing Mr. Krabs to Mrs. Puff. This scene depicts on how we act when we're in front of our crush or who we looked up to. You are overwhelmed with feelings that you just can't get the words out, like how Mr. Krabs is doing, just babbling noises. Then SpongeBob knows how to translate, being focused and ready to speak. Sometimes you may say the wrong things, but you can always get to the end by trying. Next up is the dinner date, where Mr. Krabs spends all of his money on Mrs. Puff. This tends to happen when you're blinded by love. You go over the moon just to give them the world. And that's what Mr. Krabs did. The aftermath leaves Mr. Krabs stuck between his two loves, Mrs. Puff and money. This can lead to more than just being stuck. It can ruin people's lives and end them up in debt. Or if you look the other way around, it also could mean you stop doing what you love. Maybe work related, a hobby, or maybe your passion. For instance, you donate all of your money to something that won't give you what you promised, like a GoFundMe or a Kickstarter, or some organization that promise you that you can be healed with this weird technique. It happens when you don't use logic, but this is where logic comes in and saves the day. The scene where they head over to Mrs. Puff's house. Before even thinking, hearing Mrs. Puff's voice snaps a switch in Mr. Krabs' head, overriding the whole brain, going on a money spending spree. Even though he's making the shots, he gets upset with logic not doing anything about it. But even though he is taking over. To add on to this, sometimes love can change who you are. And one of those things that can do to you is make you break promises. It is so easy to be blinded by love, doing things that you might not have even thought of doing. Fool me once, shame on you. After the whole SpongeBob spiel and Mr. Krabs crying, SpongeBob gets tricked again. Fool me twice, shame on me. Then SpongeBob goes off yelling. I don't know what he said, but whatever he did say, Mr. Krabs got the message. This can be a form of our brain being mad at ourselves, you know, like somehow you're disappointed with your own actions. And this is one way that it can show that you're mad that you didn't use logic in this situation and you purely used emotion. In the end, love can make you do things. It can change you for the worst or the better. It's what we do that matters. Using logic over emotions or just using emotions with no logic. It's kind of like a double-edged sword. You can get hurt with both sides. But talking about love, shout out to my new friend Slippy Boy. He is an amazing content creator and editor that makes wonderful videos. When I mean this, I mean this from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, Slippy. It's hard to believe in the ideas you make sometimes. My main goal for this YouTube channel is to make people happy and just to take their mind off of their life that can be stressful. Slippy does the same thing, making wonderful and funny videos talking about video games. He's also an animator too. Thank you again, my friend. May this year we make many more. If you have made it to this point of the video, thank you, my friends. Thank you for supporting a small channel that doesn't really know what he's doing. My Twitter and other links are down below. Sub to Slippy, and I'll see you next time when I make another video. Love you, and goodbye.